Sounds good. Okay, so Jillian, do you want to go ahead and open it up, or?
Yeah, we are now recording. So if you want to please introduce us, Aaron. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Aaron Sussman. I'm a planner with consulting firm Bohannon Houston, based here in Albuquerque. So this meeting is for the Taylor Ranch Golf Course Road Complete Streets Study. And we are excited to share a whole series of existing conditions analyses and work that we've been doing on this project over the course of the meeting this evening. So before we get into the details, let me allow the counselor to introduce herself and other city staff.
So good evening to the people who have joined us. I see that one individual is saying that her audio is terrible. We may have to reschedule this meeting because it appears that we're having some audio problems as well, but we're going to try to go ahead and we may have a second meeting regarding this particular group of people that were invited. I'm Counselor Borrego, Cynthia Borrego, and I just want to welcome everyone that is with us tonight. And thank you for taking the time to join us for the Complete Streets Planning Study for Taylor Ranch Road, Golf Course Road, which is the area between Westside Boulevard and Montaño Road. And I just want to inform you that I have been aware, because of public input mostly, of the many pedestrian safety concerns, traffic concerns, especially around some of our major intersections on this street for quite a long time. And so I decided to allocate some funding to hire a consultant, which we did hire Bohannon Houston, and welcome to Bohannon Houston staff. I want to introduce the staff from City Council. Of course, my assistant, Susan V. Hill, who is also my policy analyst. And then Tom Minicucci, who's one of our senior management planners. And then also Julian Moya, who does most of our audio and video. And I just want to welcome the public and thank you for participating in the study and in these public meetings. You will have opportunity to express your concerns. We've already heard from some folks, and we will have opportunity to address those concerns and then hopefully come up with some viable solutions regarding all of the traffic, pedestrian, and safety issues. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I am going to sign out because I have another commitment, but I know you're in capable hands with our staff.
So Erin, do you want to go ahead?
I was just going to say thank you, Counselor. I think she's still listening, and this is really an exciting project. We're all happy to be working on it for District 5.
Great. Well, thanks, Susan. Thanks, Tom. So again, my name is Aaron Sussman. As I mentioned, I'm a planner with a consulting firm based in Albuquerque called Bohannon Houston. So we're excited to share some of our initial findings with everybody this evening. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and go through a set of materials and give everybody background on the project and the types of analyses that we've been undertaking. And then we'll definitely allow a good amount of time for question and answer later in the session this evening. So everybody has the option as well of writing in a question in the Q&A box or in the chat feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will respond to those during the course of the meeting as appropriate, and then we'll come back to them at the end following the presentation if it's something that merits larger discussion. So with that, let me go ahead and jump right in. So can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So, great. Again, let me, I'm gonna do it. Slow. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. So let me start by giving a little bit of background on this study. And so Councilor Borrego introduced the scope and purpose of the study a little bit. We'll get into all the details and components of it over the course of the next 20-30 minutes or so in the slides, and then obviously we'll have more time for question and answer. But this is the first of 2 public meetings, and our hope this evening is to give everybody background on what this project is all about, what we think can be achieved in terms of improvements along the corridor, and all the sort of competing issues and characteristics and elements across the corridor. So we'll go into all of those in a lot more detail as we describe the existing conditions. And I'm sure many of you are, if you're residents of the area, are familiar with the corridor, travel the corridor, then you probably know what a lot of these areas of concern are, but we'll try to summarize them and talk a little bit this evening about what does that whole mean, and how do we sort of balance these conflicting interests or needs against each other, and then what ultimately can we do about it. So as I mentioned, this is the first of 2 public meetings. We'll host a second public meeting in October, and I'll talk about the schedule and next steps a little bit at the end of the meeting. So this study in particular is looking at, as Councillor mentioned, the corridor from Taylor Ranch Road, Golf Course Road, from Montaño Road north to Westside Boulevard. So it's about a 5-mile corridor. It's a really interesting facility because it traverses a lot of residential areas and then connects to these major east-west corridors, as all of you know. So there are a number of major intersections where we see commercial activity depicted in the map in orange. But it's also this corridor where we've got a lot of residential subdivisions and then sort of long distances between these commercial nodes and locations of major activity. So part of what that creates is this tension between pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users trying to access these destinations along the corridor, and residents and motorists who are using the corridor in part to access the regional transportation network. So we've got a small group, so we're going to skip the sort of interactive polling and allow for more time and questions at the end. But just to summarize again a little bit more about the purpose and need for this study. So this is a corridor, again, that connects residential, commercial, and public land uses. We've got all these sort of competing interests and competing users. So at the same time that we have high travel speeds along the corridor and we have people trying to access these commercial destinations and public uses, places, parks and open spaces and Petroglyph National Monument, we have high vehicle speeds, but we also have somewhat incomplete pedestrian and bicycle facilities across the corridor. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation, as well as the fact that there are, in a lot of parts of the corridor, rather limited opportunities to actually cross Golf Course Road. And so, we've already heard from talking to members of the public and neighborhood associations how much of a challenge that is. And so that's something that we'll come back to tonight as well. So what we hope to do with this study is to consider how we balance the reality that it is an auto-oriented corridor and it carries a lot of vehicle traffic, with the desire to create some level of community identity and kind of a Main Street character along the corridor. And so how do we do that? Applying complete streets principles and incorporating bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, addressing safety concerns, while again balancing the need for people to travel along the corridor by private vehicle as well. So ultimately, we will provide recommendations that can be designed and implemented over time. This is really just a first stage in looking at how do we address long-term improvements along Golf Course Road. But ultimately, we definitely want to come up with recommendations and design concepts that are feasible and implementable, so that the work can be carried forward in the near term rather than the long term by the city of Albuquerque for this corridor. So again, I'm sure everybody on the call is familiar with this corridor, but just to provide a little bit of regional context. So again, Golf Course Road, our study area from Montaño to Westside Boulevard. What's unique about the corridor is that it lies in between these 2 major north-south arterials in West Albuquerque, Unser and Coors, and connects to a whole other series of east-west arterials. So it's a kind of a connector route. It's a road that people use to access these other major facilities. We don't see a ton of through traffic, people driving 5 miles along the corridor, but we do see people using the corridor to access, again, the commercial nodes and shopping plazas and to access the major routes along the corridor. So part of our interest, though, is, given that it's not just a major thoroughfare like on certain cores, it provides some opportunities to create a little bit more of a neighborhood or community character along the corridor and allow for more trips to be taken by walking and biking and public transit, and to do that in a more comfortable way. So this is a complete streets study. So one of the things that we wanted to do at the beginning of this session was to define complete streets. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with this concept, complete streets is really more than anything an approach to transportation planning that's related to how roads design and how they function. And the idea is that roadways should be safe for all modes of traffic, not just motorists. And so they need to be accessible for people of different needs and abilities, for people who want to walk and bike along the corridor. It doesn't always mean that we're just going to bring traffic to a standstill. I wanted to show an example on the right part of the screen here from Martin Luther King Boulevard between University of New Mexico and downtown, where improvements that were made through striping and some other minor modifications allowed for improved bike facilities, more distance between pedestrians and motorists along the corridor. But we still keep the same number of driving lanes. We keep the same types and locations of turn lanes. But there's still opportunities then to really make this corridor work for other users. So that's the concept behind Complete Streets. And this project is in line with the City of Albuquerque's Complete Streets policy, which was updated a couple years ago. And the idea of the Complete Streets policy is there's an opportunity for the city to consider how to incorporate better facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians as part of roadway improvement efforts, as part of maintenance and repaving efforts. But the city can also address roadways proactively in places like Golf Course Road, where we know that there are safety challenges and high travel speeds and conflicts among different user groups. So that's the logic and sort of concept behind the Complete Streets approach to this project. So my expectation is that everybody's familiar with at least parts of Golf Course Road, but one of the things that we wanted to do was to give everybody a chance to sort of see the whole corridor from south to north. So I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Alex Waltz, to do something of a virtual tour along the corridor. So go ahead, Alex.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. Alex Waltz. I'm a planner with Bohannon Houston. And yeah, like Aaron said, we wanted to just walk you through different aspects of the corridor, going from the southernmost portion all the way to the northernmost portion. So the first segment of the corridor between Montaño Road and Calle Norteña carries generally between 18,000 and 21,000 vehicles per day. And one other note about these vehicle figures is that they were collected prior to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. This segment of the corridor has two travel lanes going in each direction, which are separated by a median. The pedestrian infrastructure generally consists of 5 to 6 foot wide sidewalks. The southbound side of the corridor has continuous facilities, but based on our analysis, we found that there were gaps on the northbound side of the corridor. The bicycle infrastructure is kind of a mix of on-street and off-street facilities. There are 5 foot on-street lanes on both sides of the road between Montaño Road and La Orilla Road. But north of La Orilla, these lanes disappear. And generally they're, could be considered to be replaced by a 10 foot wide shared use trail that's located only on the northbound side of the road between La Orilla Road and Plume Road. And there's also a 10 foot wide shared use trail on the southbound side of the road that's associated with Mariposa Basin Park, although this trail does not connect to existing curb ramps at Kachina Street. Next slide.
There aren't
So
a lot of
moving north.
crossings, are there, Alex?
I'm sorry?
There's this extensive trail on the north side, or the northbound side, but the crossing golf course isn't facilitated.
There is a pedestrian crossing at La Orilla Road for that trail, but it does require crossing a couple different slip lanes and obviously the width of the road. So, depending on the bicyclist or pedestrian's comfort level, it could be a challenge. But other than that, one signalized intersection, there aren't any other opportunities to cross to access this trail. And thanks for that, Susan. So now moving north between Calle Norteña and Paradise Boulevard, you can see that this portion of the corridor has slightly higher traffic volumes between roughly 26,000 and 30,500 vehicles per day. Again, there are 2 lanes going in each direction, which are separated by a median, as you can see in this image in the upper left. The pedestrian infrastructure on this portion of the corridor consists of 5 to 6 foot wide sidewalks on both sides of the street. And this segment of the corridor has continuous facilities for pedestrians. The bicycle infrastructure does not include any on-street facilities, but there is a 10-foot wide shared use trail on the northbound side of the road between Paseo del Norte and Paradise Boulevard. And in addition, this portion of the corridor intersects with the Piedras Marcadas Trail just north of Calle Norteña, which you can see again in this image in the upper left. And it's a designated crossing, although it doesn't have any crosswalk markings. Moving north again, the portion of the corridor between Paradise Boulevard and Irving Boulevard is owned by Bernalillo County, which is somewhat different than other portions of the corridor, which are owned by the city of Albuquerque. You can see that the traffic volumes decrease a little bit on this portion, going down to between roughly 18,500 and 20,000 vehicles per day. Again, similar to other segments of the corridor, there are 2 travel lanes going in each direction, but in contrast to the other portions, there isn't a median separating the 2 directions. And instead, you can see in this image on the left that there's a 2-way continuous left turn lane, allowing drivers to take left turns throughout the corridor. The pedestrian infrastructure generally consists of 6-foot wide sidewalks. The northbound side has continuous facilities along this portion, but there are gaps on the southbound side. And you can see that in this image here. The sidewalk ends just where that fence begins on the left-hand side of this image, which would be the southbound side of the road. The bicycle infrastructure, you can again see it in the image here, is comprised of 5-foot wide stripe lanes going in both directions. And there are no off-street shared use paths along this portion of the corridor. Next slide.
Is it the portion of the corridor that's controlled by the county?
Yes, exactly. Yep. So this portion between Paradise and Irving is owned by Bernalillo County. Next slide. So now the northernmost portion of the corridor between Irving Boulevard and Westside Boulevard at its peak carries the most vehicles throughout the corridor, ranging from roughly 20,000 vehicles per day to 34,000 vehicles per day. Again, there are 2 lanes going in each direction, but in contrast to the previous segment, they are separated by a median here. Pedestrian infrastructure consists of sidewalks ranging in size from 4 to 6 feet wide. The southbound side of the road has continuous facilities, but we did observe that there were gaps on the northbound side. The bicycle infrastructure here consists of 5-foot on-street striped lanes going in both directions, although at some points along this segment, the lanes are a little bit narrower than 5 feet, and there are no off-street shared use paths. This portion of the corridor does have a significant grade change, which from our discussions with city staff have told us that generally speeding is, I guess, most prevalent on this portion of the corridor because of that grade change. So as drivers go down and up the hill, depending on what direction they're coming from, generally that's where we see the highest speeds. And I noticed that there's a question from Pat. This meeting will be recorded. So yeah, sorry about the audio issues that you're having, Pat, but this meeting will be recorded, so you'll be able to hopefully watch it at a later time.
We'll put it on the counselor's website, I believe, right, Julian? And also it will.
Yes, we'll post to the counselor's website.
It doesn't automatically go to YouTube or anything like that.
Got it. Okay. All right. And yeah, so that's the tour. And I'll turn it back to Aaron to talk about existing conditions.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So we wanted to dig in to existing conditions at a little bit deeper level. So first starting off with just sort of an overview of the conditions along the corridor, and then, really starting to diagnose what sort of challenges and do we face. And when we get into the recommendations and design component of the project, what should we be focusing our energies on? So let me start with, again, summarizing the roadway conditions. So as Alex mentioned, the traffic volumes range from 18,000 to 34,000 vehicles per day. The corridor is consistently 2 lanes in each direction across the entire corridor. And the posted speeds are about 35 to 40 miles an hour, depending on the segment. What we do see, though, is that there are some sort of variations in things like access along the corridor, and the type of facilities or infrastructure in the middle of the road. So as Alex pointed out, there are some portions of the corridor with raised medians, other portions with center turn lanes. Access into residential areas or to commercial areas is generally limited, with the exception of the area in and around between Cayo Montaño and Paradise Boulevard in particular, and Paseo del Norte intersection. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But again, this is a corridor that carries a lot of vehicles to these east-west arterials. And so one of the things that we notice is that there's a lot of variability in traffic volume from segment to segment. And part of what that means is that it's, we have kind of inconsistent conditions from segment to segment. So that becomes a little bit of a challenge in thinking about what sort of modifications one might want to see along the corridor from a vehicle user standpoint. At the same time, we also observe a decent amount of congestion along the corridor, and I'm sure residents observe this. And so we have this kind of challenging set of phenomena where we have high vehicle speeds during parts of the day and depending on the direction, but we also have portions of the corridor that can get pretty congested, especially approaching the major intersections. So all of the, in the images on the right, the 2 maps on the right, these are maps that show congestion levels essentially. And so the darker the color, the higher the levels of congestion. And so what we see from the data from the Mid-Region Council of Governments for this corridor is that there are traffic volumes that either approach or exceed the intended roadway capacity. So what that means is that there's more cars on the road in certain times of the day than the road was intended to handle. And so one of the consequences of that is that results in delay, especially again, approaching the major intersections where people need to sometimes wait for multiple signals to make those east or west turns. At the same time that we have conditions approaching or exceeding congestion or capacity levels today, traffic volumes are expected to grow by 5 to 10% over the next 20 years. So we do expect to see, again, a little bit more traffic over time along this corridor.
How much does the capacity being exceeded currently?
In some cases, it's something like 15%. And again, that's just 15 to 20%. And that's really confined to the peak periods. I mean, one of the things that I think everybody observes about this corridor is that there's times of the day where it's pretty, it's not very heavily trafficked. But especially in the morning and evening commute times when people are accessing those east-west arterials like Paseo del Norte or Paradise or McMahon, Ellison, there are parts of the corridor that are very, very heavily trafficked. So it's those kinds of analyses, Susan, are really focused on the peak periods or the peak hour. But it's a little bit deceptive, right? Because there's times of the day when there's not a lot of traffic. And then when there's not a lot of traffic, that creates conditions for motorists to travel at really high speeds. So we have a lot of just variability in conditions along the corridor. One of the other major challenges with the corridor in terms of managing traffic is the fact that we have these commercial nodes around major intersections, which is important in terms of providing services in the area, but it also creates conflicts at the locations that tend to be congested during the peak periods anyways. So one of the things that's been really a focus of our efforts, and we're hearing repeatedly from members of the public, are concerns about this particular shopping plaza in particular, the Petroglyph Plaza to the southwest corner of Paseo del Norte, where the Starbucks in particular is a culprit, and the queues associated with drive-through at the Starbucks will spill onto Golf Course Road, create delay, create all sorts of unsafe conditions and poor sight lines. And so that's something that we're very much focusing on. So we have this delay associated with the intersections. We also have challenges with the grade of the roadway, as Alex mentioned. So the farther north we go along the corridor, we have these steep descent and ascent in and away from the Calabasas Arroyo. We also have fairly long distances and stretches of the corridor between signalized intersections. So Susan, you're asking about that earlier. So not only is that an impediment for pedestrians, but long distances between traffic signals creates opportunities for people to speed up in their vehicles. So again, sort of a broad range of challenges along the corridor. From a non-auto perspective, there are, again, sort of opportunities to build upon and then challenges. And so the map on the right shows existing and proposed bicycle facilities, both along Golf Course Road and in and around the study area. Everything in dashed lines is proposed. And so what you'll see is there have been a lot of projects that have been identified or proposed both along Golf Course Road and intersecting with Golf Course Road. But at present, we have some significant gaps along the corridor, in particular between La Orilla and Paseo del Norte, where there are no on-street bikeway facilities at all, and no multi-use trails in that stretch either. So this corridor has kind of a mix, as Alex mentioned, of sidewalks, multi-use trails at sidewalk level, on-street bikeways, and we also have some major east-west trails that connect with Golf Course Road, including along Paradise Boulevard and the Piedras Marcadas Trail to the south of Paseo del Norte and to the north of Calle Norteña. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, we again have these long distances between signalized intersections that makes it hard for bicyclists and pedestrians to access the commercial areas along the corridor. Where we do have on-street bikeways, in many cases they're narrow and there's no separation for motorists. And so really what that creates is these conditions where if you've got motorists going 40 plus miles an hour, high numbers of vehicles per day, and not much separation between bicyclists and traffic, it's pretty uncomfortable for anybody walking and biking along stretches of the corridor. And really what that means is that only the most confident bicyclists are likely to ride along Golf Course Road under current conditions. That's different where we've got these multi-use trails like the one in the upper right, or the trail at sidewalk level approaching Paradise Boulevard. The other dynamic along this corridor is that we have this interesting mix of residential activity and commercial nodes. So we've got long stretches of subdivision walls that face Golf Course Road. We also have the stretch of Golf Course Road between Paradise and Irving Boulevard in the unincorporated county portion of Golf Course Road, where we've got residences and direct driveway access from the corridor. But this long kind of commercial or long residential corridor is then kind of punctuated by these commercial nodes, which are real kind of focal points in the Northwest Albuquerque area. So again, I mentioned the Petroglyph Plaza, but there's other commercial areas along the corridor that generate a lot of trips, and that ideally are places that we could create more opportunities for people to walk and bike to along Golf Course Road. We also need to recognize and remember that there's a decent amount of transit service along this corridor. There's a major transit route, Route 157, which operates every 30 minutes. It goes all the way from Northwest Albuquerque and the Northwest Transit Center off of Ellison Drive, down Golf Course to Montaño, across to Louisiana, connects to Uptown, and ultimately to the Kirtland Air Force Base. There's also a commuter route, which only operates in the morning and evening peak periods, which connects to downtown and to UNM. But one of the challenges along this corridor is, again, related to land use, that, because we have a lot of subdivisions with walls facing the corridor, accessing transit is a little bit limited at this point. We've also looked at safety conditions along the corridor. And again, for those of you who are familiar with Golf Course Road, this will probably reinforce things that you've already heard or already know and have seen. The map in the middle of the screen shows concentrations of crashes along the corridor. It's a heat map. And then the map on the right shows the distribution of severe crashes where there's an injury or fatality involved. And so what we see along the corridor is that the crashes are concentrated primarily between Calle Norteña and Paradise Boulevard. There's major hotspots where there's lots of crashes around McMahon Boulevard, Paradise Boulevard, and Paseo del Norte. And one of the things that we see is that there's a pretty strong correlation between locations of crashes and conflicts at access points, in particular around, again, the Petroglyph Plaza shopping center. But we also see sort of some distribution of crashes along the corridor. But again, the greatest concentration and the most severe crashes are between Calle Norteña and Paradise Boulevard. We do have data showing a number of bicycle or pedestrian involved crashes, including multiple crashes at Montaño Road and fatal bicycle or pedestrian involved crashes at Paseo del Norte and Irving Boulevard. So at this point, I wanted to recap a few comments and concerns that we've received so far before we get into a little bit of, so what do we make of all this information? And so I wanted to acknowledge that before we sort of wrap things up. And so one of the sort of recurring themes that we've heard from comments in public meetings and comments submitted through the website is that pedestrians definitely do not feel safe walking along the roadway. People have identified a real challenge in crossing Golf Course Road, both as pedestrians and as motorists. There's a lot of concerns about speeding, about racing, and a few intersections in particular have been cited with frequency in terms of locations of safety concerns or where some sort of intervention might be desired, or at least per the public comments that we've received. And those are Marnolin Road, Samara Road, and Calle Norteña. So I wanted to wrap up with a few key takeaways, our observations, and then open up for discussion. So, again, what we just observe is overall this tension between traffic flow and safety for other modes along the corridor. So again, there's a lot of traffic, especially at certain types of the day, but we'd like to see from a complete street standpoint, from an access to commercial nodes perspective, opportunities for other users of other modes. But currently there are gaps in those networks. So from a bicyclist and pedestrian standpoint, the networks are incomplete. There's places where the sidewalks end or bike lanes end, other places where they're very narrow and you feel very close to oncoming traffic. So there are the conditions that make motorists, or that again make pedestrians and bicyclists feel uncomfortable along the corridor. At the same time, there are some really high quality shared use trails that connect along the corridor, and there's opportunities to sort of integrate those trails and make them more integrated and connect better to the commercial nodes along Golf Course Road. But again, one other observation, and I know we've repeated this a number of times, but it's worth mentioning again, the lack of crossing opportunities along the corridor. And there's a real opportunity for improvement there, especially if we're trying to encourage more trips by bicyclists and pedestrians. And then from a sort of more integrated land use and transportation side of things, we again, this is a corridor that's interesting because we've got these building blocks, we've got pieces of bicycle and pedestrian networks, and we've got retail and service destinations along the corridor that people are accessing. So how can we improve those facilities? And that's something that we'll want to talk about a little bit more this evening. And one of the things that we observed that's really creates an opportunity is that there are wide medians along the corridor. The stretches where the travel lanes are wider than recommended in the city's design standards. And so there may be opportunities to narrow travel lanes and narrow the medians along the corridor and reallocate that space for other users and create some separation between motorists and bicyclists and pedestrians. And one of the last pieces that I want to talk about is a part of the purpose of this project and study has been to think about how do we create something of a more of a Main Street character along Golf Course Road? Because again, this is not Coors, it's not Unser, it's not carrying motorists long distances, but we don't have sort of the classic, Main Street kind of character areas like we might see in Nob Hill or downtown Silver City, the image on the upper right. But the shopping plazas, the commercial nodes along the corridor, there's parks, there's a community center, there's other destinations that residents of Northwest Albuquerque wish to access, and would be nice to provide other options for people to access those sites without getting in a car. And so what does that look like? So there's kind of two angles to this. So one is bringing people to those destinations, and then the second is, are there any opportunities to make improvements within those commercial nodes or shopping plazas? So again, from a transportation standpoint, bringing people to those commercial centers, if there's an opportunity to reallocate space for bicyclists, pedestrians, or transit users, that would have the dual benefits of slowing down traffic to some degree and then creating safer and more comfortable conditions for bicyclists and pedestrians. If sidewalks could be widened, if we could put in landscaping and buffers or wider bike lanes and buffered bike lanes to, again, just create more separation, more comfort level. And one of the consequences of those things too would be you may reduce travel speeds a little bit in places where we observe speeding and racing. Providing, again, more pedestrian crossings near these commercial nodes and shopping plazas is a real opportunity. And if we can close the gaps in the sidewalk and the bike lane networks and connect existing trails, then we at least give people the option and opportunity to access these places without relying on a private vehicle all of the time. But one of the challenges along this corridor is it's largely built out. There's not a lot of undeveloped land, and then the commercial nodes are privately owned. And so there are lots of interesting examples across the country and even in Albuquerque in terms of commercial strips and shopping plazas redeveloping in ways that are more pedestrian oriented. But it does take cooperation among the city and private landowners to make those kinds of things happen. So at this point, we wanted to kind of let you know where we go next and then open it up for questions. So again, this is our review of the existing conditions analysis and our first sort of set of thoughts about what does it all mean and how do we sort of turn this study into a coherent set of recommendations. And then we'll present our more fleshed out recommendations and some design concepts at a second public meeting in October and produce a draft report and recommendations document in October, November of this year. So at this point, I guess I'll encourage everybody to continue to check out the website and stay in touch with city staff and Susan and Tom from Council Services. And at this point, I'm happy to, again, answer questions and open it up for some discussion.
I was just thinking, because we're doing a different piece, some of the open space areas, or just looking at those open space areas and the potential for open space in District 5 and the trails network. And it is an extensive trails network, similar to what you see on the east side of Albuquerque, leading up into the Sandias. And I'm just speculating, but I think that's why there are fatalities on Montaño, because that leads directly to the petroglyphs for the bicyclists. But so how closely are you looking at those entrances into the open space and the trail system for connections from golf course?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so, I mean, our primary focus is on the corridor itself, and then and the east-west connections along the corridor. But the point that people use golf course to access these wider network of destinations or sets of destinations is really important. And so part of what that means is, again, you know, what's the role of golf course in facilitating access to recreational sites across Northwest Albuquerque? And it's not just about how do we move traffic along Golf Course Road, but how do we enable people to access open space sites and trails and parks that are not just along Golf Course Road. So it's a facility that allows people to access all these other sites. So that's I think how it comes together, Susan. I think I saw that Nina had her hand raised.
Yep, Nina asked, or is commenting, there's a need for a pedestrian crossing. Sorry. Should we start with Susan first? Just going in order here. Susan is saying, have you looked at the entrance to Paradise Hills Golf Course from the northbound side, turning left onto Country Club Road? Southbound folks are turning east onto Green in that same area. And the middle turn lane is often used by folks turning east and west in the same space.
So that's good to know in terms of those dynamics, and that's the kind of feedback and information that we're looking for. And so I guess the best way for me to answer that question is we can look into it, and that's the type of feedback and input that we're looking for as part of this meeting tonight. And as we continue in the study to understand very specific locations where there's those sort of quirks in travel behavior along the corridor, so that we can make sure that any recommendations or design concepts would take those into account.
And next from Nina, who's saying, there's a need for a pedestrian crossing on Golf Course Road along the Black Arroyo channels leading to the Black Arroyo Dam, especially with the new development going on in the northernmost vacant lot at Golf Course Road and Westside Boulevard.
Yeah, thank
One
you for
other thing
that.
about that, yeah.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead,
Alex.
Alex.
So one of the things that we did hear from other members of the project team is that the Black Arroyo Dam area is really popular among residents for recreation. But thanks for adding some additional, I guess, support for that need, Nina.
And I'll add to that too, just to say that one of the things that we're very clearly looking at, and we know we mentioned a number of times, is the opportunities for additional pedestrian crossings along the corridor. So We're looking at spacing. Where could crossings be located that would be most valuable in terms of access to commercial plazas and recreational sites along the corridor. But there's also all sorts of considerations in terms of distance from traffic signals and site distance, and making sure that we're not putting anybody into harm's way as well. So that's very much a next step in this study, is to take that diagnosis that we need more pedestrian crossings, gather input on potential locations, and then perform the technical analysis to determine which locations are most appropriate.
And there are a number of schools off of golf course, or
There are a number of schools along golf course as well. Yeah.
for students to walk to.
Yeah, or certainly near golf course, where students would use golf course to access the schools.
So that's being considered in your pedestrian analysis.
Absolutely, that those are the types of pedestrian generators that we'd like to make sure to accommodate as safely as possible.
I mean, I live in the valley and I've seen like real little children walking. And I think that's not really safe, but I guess their parents trained them enough that they feel like it's all right. Like, 7-year-olds and their big brother. But if it is,
Right.
the point when people make that choice for whatever reason, they're trying to get to work and they think that their kid is trained enough or conscious enough to make it, how do we make the streets safe as well?
I think just to build off that point, Susan, one thing that we know from various studies is that children generally have a more difficult time judging appropriate gaps in traffic. And so they might not understand, as well as an adult might, when a safe time to cross is. And one of the things about Golf Course Road that might make that crossing situation a bit more dangerous is that there are a few opportunities where you might be able to make a 2-stage crossing at a place that's not a signalized intersection. So that would allow you to, as a pedestrian or bicyclist crossing the street, only focus on one direction at a time. Because right now, if you're trying to cross at an uncontrolled location that doesn't have a traffic signal, you basically have to, in general, although the medians do help a little bit, but you have to keep an eye on all directions of traffic, but the lack of formalized locations for crossing also makes it more difficult because drivers do not know when to expect pedestrians to cross the street. And so kind of formalizing some of those crossing locations is certainly one of the things that we're looking at.
I also see some designs where they actually walk off a sidewalk with these giant cement pillars, not giant, but big enough to indicate that this is a safe zone for children walking. That's interesting. I think they do it in Japan.
Oh, interesting. If you wouldn't mind, if you have any pictures available, you could send them to us, that'd be great.
So are there any other, from the attendees, are there any other questions? Or they would like us on that one there? If there are not, then I think we're good to go ahead. And Aaron, do you have a last minute summary or anything?
No, I guess I just want to thank everybody again for taking the time to attend this evening. And if you have questions or comments or other things that you want us to keep in mind, please send. There's multiple ways to make your comments heard, I suppose. So you can email any of the email addresses on the screen. You can also submit comments through the website, and that's Councilor Borrego's district website page through the city of Albuquerque. And the kind of specific comments that we heard about turning movements at individual locations along the corridor, those are really helpful for us to understand where to hone in and focus our energies and think about, again, what sort of competing uses and challenges do we see along certain parts of the corridor. So again, thank you for your time and appreciate questions and comments. And you're, again, more than welcome to reach out, and we'll be happy to discuss any particular concerns further.
Great. Well,
And the
thank-
next meeting is October 21st, and we will have that information on the counselor's webpage.
on that one. And there is a slight possibility too that because we had a little bit of an error in the ID, that we may have another initial meeting such as this one, just in case there are other people who are unable to get on tonight. But that we'll find that out during the next coming week.
We'll have to see if the incorrect information was sent out, which at this moment we don't think it was, but we'll check. We're always happy to meet and talk about the project.
So thank you much.
Everyone for your time. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.